In the 30th century, change is constant. Humanity has been racing forwards ever since the fall of the tyrannical mazzars and has made advances in just about every field, especially militarily. Yet, despite ships like the Hornet and Bengal becoming some of the most recognized and battle-tested military craft in human history, one ship has remained, proving the old adage true: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The ship that is the emperor of the light fighters, the venerable Aegis Gladius. My name is Paul Shelley, and welcome to the AstroHistorian. This is a channel dedicated to exploring and explaining the lore of sci-fi and space universes and discussing their impact. Today we'll be talking about the universe of Star Citizen, specifically the context and history of the workhorse fighter of the UEE military, the Aegis Gladius. The P-5G Gladius is an institution in the UEE military. It holds multiple notable records, though it's most known for being the longest-serving fighter platform in human history, with it being in active service with the UEE for over 350 years. It's a ship so revolutionary in its design that it entirely redefined what an aerospace fighter was. The Gladius is the granddaddy of all modern aerospace fighters built by humans. That alone is worth respect, but what makes the Gladius stand out is that it's not only the first modern design, but the fact that it has remained so versatile, effective, and beloved for over 3 centuries after its release. Now, this doesn't mean that the Gladius that was released in 2579 is the exact same version you can pick up today at New Deal. If you manage to bring a Gladiopilot from the early Mazzar era and stick them into one that rolled off the assembly line today, they'd have no idea what they're looking at. The space frame has undergone countless changes over the years, typically being the stand-in for any new technology made to improve fighter design. That being said, there's one thing that has remained mostly consistent throughout the centuries: its look. The exterior has only marginally changed since it was first introduced, and has allowed for dozens of changes and upgrades over the years, proving just how well the ship was designed from its inception. To truly understand the Gladius, however, we're going to need to go way back in human history, well before the creation of the ship itself, to a time before military aerospace fighters were even a thing, and the biggest limiting factors of military spacecraft design were power, heat, and life support. The Navy ships of the early post-unification war period were extremely primitive by modern standards. Quantum drives of the period would run extremely hot and require an immense amount of power. Ships were, by necessity, larger overall than modern spacecraft, to house larger power plants, which weren't as efficient as their modern equivalents. Heat is an issue in the vacuum of space, as 2 of the 3 means of cooling simply don't work, namely conduction and convection. This left only radiation as a means to cool ships, which was the primary means of cooling hot spacecraft since the basic ships of the 20th century. Due to this limitation, the best way to cool ships off was to give them large radiator panels, or make them so big that they had more surface area to radiate heat. So the early interplanetary and interstellar ships of humanity, which had heat-inefficient quantum and jump drives, were very large to take advantage of this. You add to this the fact that quantum speeds were much slower than modern ships. That meant you were taking longer to reach a destination with a less efficient and very hot quantum drive. Thus, in order to reach many destinations without stopping to cool down your ship many times, your ship had to be much larger than you would need. For example, the first mass-produced and marketed ship, the RSI Zeus, was likely in the range of a modern RSI Constellation, despite having most of the characteristics of a modern medium or small ship. Because of these limitations in heat management and power generation, life support had to work longer and harder, keeping the crew both alive with atmosphere and preventing them from being cooked alive inside the ship from these excessive temperatures, thus taking more power and required to be larger. This leads us to the other major issue of the time: shield technology. Let me begin with a caveat. Human shield tech has not been definitively nailed down by the narrative team, but they have made vague statements about what they want the story to be. So this section is based off the best evidence thus far that I can find. Humanity may have only had limited shield tech, if none at all, in the early years. However, by the 25th century, it is referenced that some basic and primitive shield technology existed in some form to be able to handle the star flares of Pyro. It should be noted that these shields could not take extensive flares over a brief period of time, proving that they were indeed very primitive. It's also known that these shields required enormous amounts of power to exist. Overall, the ships of humanity, including its warships, were large, slow, and inefficient machines. This means that anything smaller than a modern-day medium ship would be at most an atmospheric shuttle, and the idea of anything coming close to a space fighter wasn't even feasible, let alone desired by military strategists at the time. It seems that human warship design centered around large vessels which were able to be fitted with shields, thus massive power plants, which allowed for more placements of weapons, chief among them ballistic and directed energy weapons. That would all change when humanity encountered its first alien civilization, the Banu. I've covered first contact with Banu in other videos, so I won't go too in depth, but after the disaster that was Banu First Contact, almost ending with a panicked human explorer shooting at a lone Banu fighter, the UNE military realized how woefully undermatched they were for a potential future war. While we don't know if the Banu had more advanced technology than humanity at the time, it is likely that at the very least the Banu possessed better power plants, quantum drives, and even shield technology. We know this now because after the end of the human-Xi'an Cold War, we discovered that the Banu made first contact with the Xi'an in the early 20th century. At that point, the Banu had already settled multiple star systems, and after first contact, the Banu were trading with the Xi'an as equals. This initial first contact encounter panicked the leaders of the UNE military, because if the Banu, a mostly peaceful species dedicated to commerce and craftsmanship, were able to mass produce a small ship with built-in shield technology, then humanity was far behind in our technological prowess. This post-contact period was filled with a rush of new designs and technologies to try and improve humanity's warfighting capabilities, including some of the first military rail cannons and mass drivers, along with more advanced directed energy weapons, faster quantum drives, more efficient power plants, and better shields. Even still, by the time humanity made first contact with the Xi'an, they were still unable to give ships the size of the Perseus shield technology, which is why that ship is excessively armored compared to modern standards, with a point defense system coming standard. That doesn't mean that the military of the UNE and then its successor, the UPE, wasn't improving. By the early 26th century, fighters began to be integrated into the Navy, mostly heavy fighters. There may have been some breakthroughs in cooling and quantum drive tech in this time period to allow for smaller ships to be combat effective, though they still lacked shields. In many ways, this was the golden age of heavy fighters, with them being the primary fighter design used in combat. Smaller fighters were regulated to fleet defense and convoy escort, and meant mostly as a means to delay the enemy before the larger ships could arrive. It was at this time that what I consider one of the most important companies to the future of aerospace aviation was created: Elio Harmon. Elio Harmon was founded in 2456 in the aftermath of the first contact with the Banu, during the first wave of new armor manufacturers, along with Hurston Dynamics. We don't know much about Elio Harmon except they made spacecraft, likely principally for the military, and also likely with the new technology being developed and acquired through trade with the Banu. They don't appear to have made much of an impact in their little over a century of being in business, save for a single ship. This ship is, in my opinion, the most important ship to modern space fighter development, because it was the catalyst for proving that smaller and lighter fighters were valuable platforms, and directly led to the development of the Gladius. I am, of course, talking about the legendary Elio-Harmon Stiletto interceptor. We have no images or any visual representation of the ship, but what we do know is that it was classified as a medium interceptor and was described as a weaponized tube. It was solely designed to serve in space and may have used chemical propellant similar to human space capsules. Because of the limitations of shield technology at the time, it was launched out of an airlock-type tube built into the sides of larger ships, and was recovered afterwards to be reloaded into these tubes. Effectively, it was what we would call today a snub or parasite fighter. The closest modern example would be the recent Mirai Fury line of ships, but the size of a modern F-7A Hornet due to technical limitations at the time. It generally was assigned to fleet defense because of its limited range, often used as a combat air patrol to intercept fighters, bombers, and torpedoes. While it did its job admirably, the ship was considered to be a dead-end assignment for most Navy pilots. Stiletto pilots were filled with riff-raff of the Navy, made up of enlisted and OCS pilots rather than the elite academy graduates, which often made up the higher command structure of the Navy. Overall, it was a stepping stone in design, an experiment in how small humanity could make a fighting ship. The true test of the ship would happen when the First Tevarin War broke out, a test which it failed spectacularly. You see, this weaponized tube was going up against one of the all-time greatest fighters in the history of the galaxy, the Tevarin Talon, and the Stiletto never stood a chance. To be fair to Elio-Harmon, even larger heavy fighters struggled to deal with the Talon, but when your best interceptor can't beat the thing it's supposed to intercept, then you have problems. Humanity struggled against the Tevarin, mostly because the UPE military was woefully unprepared and under-equipped to deal with the highly organized and martial species. If it weren't for humanity's ingenuity, unbreakable spirits, our sheer numbers, and brilliant leadership under figures like Rachel Locke, Hester Polaris, Adam Core, and yes, Ivar Mezzer, the UPE and humanity would be a protectorate of the Tevarin Empire. I seriously cannot underestimate how lopsided the early conflicts were, and it was all because of technology. While humanity had pushed out into the stars and perfected terraforming, faster quantum drive, and innovative resource extraction, the Tevarin perfected space combat. Between zero-G stealth specialists of the Naule, who could board and entirely seize a human capital ship without alerting the crew, to their flawless hit-and-run tactics using their more maneuverable and better protected fighters, the Tevarin gave the UPE a personal, painful lesson in how to fight in space. They could do this because their big technological breakthrough was power-efficient shield technology. This allowed for ships like the Prowler dropship to not only be shielded from attack, but have atmospheric shields to allow for quick infiltration, and to do so being virtually invisible to human sensor technology. Even the Talon was equipped with powerful shields, which allowed it to be built with less armor and thus less mass. The Tevarin were almost a century ahead of humanity when it came to their weapons of war, and it was a gap the UPE generals and admirals were keen on closing as fast as possible. Soon after the start of the war, the then up-and-coming Aegis Dynamics began work on a ship that, arguably, would save humanity, the Aegis Dynamics Retaliator bomber. While it's not clear, there are indications that the Tally may have been the first bomber developed with Tevarin-derived shield tech, as it seems that even early models of the ship were equipped with them. It would be the Retaliator that would both prove the viability of small-scale shields and Aegis Dynamics itself, as it was used with great effectiveness during the liberation of Idris IV from the Tevarin, with a young Captain Ivar Mezzer calling in danger-close, round-the-clock strikes on advancing Tevarin forces who were trying to destroy the early beachhead. By the end of the war, the Retaliator was being used to strike at the heart of the homeworld of the Tevarin, and was the ship which broke the backs of the tevarin species, sending them either fleeing into a diaspora or hauled away in chains to be trophies in humanity's victory parades. It was clear to all military analysts at the time that miniaturized shield tech was the future of space warfare. However, the cogs of the military-industrial complex turn slowly, and new technology is very expensive to build. You have research and development costs combined with often rare and exotic materials and manufacturing, which will often make fragile end products that aren't fit for frontline conditions. Often, it can take decades for new technologies to be at the point where they can reach their true potential. With that in mind, you might be able to see why the UPE didn't instantly capitalize on new technologies captured from the tevarin. They just fought a costly war, and they didn't have the funds to dump freighters worth of credits into new products, now that the immediate threat was gone. It would require a government overthrow and one of the biggest military defeats in UEE history to finally set into motion the creation of the greatest space dogfighter in human history. Ira Mezzer, hero of the Tevarin Wars, who personally brought the leader of the Tevarin in chains to the front of the Senate, was unsurprisingly elected as High General of the UPE after the end of the war. However, the combat leader now found himself in a more bureaucratic role, and the limitations he had on him were frustrating, to say the least. He saw humanity surrounded by potentially hostile aliens without a strong central leader able to protect the species. All around him were politicians whose lackluster preparations led to the massive loss of life in the Tevarin War, and were again slipping back into old, bad habits. He knew someone needed to take the reins and prepare for the next inevitable war, likely with the Xi'an, and he figured he was the one to do it. So by 2546, through some very less than legal means, he was able to form a new centralized government, with him at the head, transforming the United Planets of Earth into the United Empire of Earth. With this transformation came a new and powerful ally to the military-industrial complex, one willing to give them a blank check, as long as they made him the best tools to prepare humanity for the coming war. Aegis Dynamics, a company he had grown close with during the Tevarin War, as their bombers had literally saved his life, would become the ultimate victor in this new arrangement, securing funding and contracts for almost all new space frames from then on out. Aegis would capitalize on this with an experimental ship that would teach them how to make this new breed of spacefighter, known as the Comet program. We don't know a lot about the Comet, but what we do know is the brains behind this leap in technology, one of the many heroes to emerge from the infamous Battle of Idris IV, famed dogfighter Captain Kamur Dalyon. Dalyon was recruited by Aegis Dynamics to be a military advisor upon his retirement from the Navy. It should be noted, however, that his original recruitment owed more to his personal relationship with Ivar Mezzer than his initial qualifications. However, within a few years of working for Aegis, Dalyon had fully integrated himself within the design team. He would famously say that if Aegis was going to be paying him, he was damn well going to work. His decades of combat experience provided the company with keen insight on how real starmen would use the crafts in the field. Dalyon was even known to get dirty and do off-the-record test piloting of ships himself. But the lasting monument to his time with the company has to be the Aegis Comet Light Fighter. Built from the ground up with Dalyon's supervision, the Comet was an entirely new kind of fighter, and the proving ground for much of the tech and design that would distinguish Aegis in the centuries to come. Nimble and deadly, the Comet was an instant hit with pilots and remains a much-loved ship of the era, earning an almost revered status in large part to its extremely short production line. Considered expensive even for a military ship and requiring highly specialized parts and repair, the Comet was quickly retired in favor of later generations of ships, specifically what was known as Project Wildcat. This leads us to the second event that would directly lead to the creation of the Gladius, one of the most monumental screw-ups in naval history: the fall of the Olympus, and the last stand of the Olympus Combat Air Patrol. In 2571, the battle carrier UES Olympus pursued a band of human and Tevarin rebels home to their hiding place in the undeveloped Null system. The carrier's complement vastly outmatched their foe, but the admiral in charge wanted in on the kill personally. He ordered the Olympus into a pass that was too close to the system's fifth planet, Shana. As a result, the Olympus was caught in the planet's gravity and impacted on the world's surface and lost, with only a few survivors. Those survivors included the carrier's Combat Air Patrol, 4 stiletto interceptors belonging to the carrier's defensive complement, plus 2 others who managed a scrambled launch as the ship went down. Taking quick advantage of their unbelievable shift in fortune, the rebel forces rallied to eliminate the remaining ships and lifeboats. The stage was set for one of the most one-sided fights in history: 6 aging and badly outdated ships versus the entire arrayed forces of the rebels. However, the outmatched stiletto pilots were about to give the rebels a lesson in humility. With their backs against the wall, the entirely overmatched fighters pushed their machines to the limit and fought off the oncoming attackers for almost an hour straight. These ships scored an astonishing 37 confirmed space-to-space kills, including a pocket destroyer, with only their surviving primitive energy weapons. Despite their valiant efforts, however, they could not fight fate forever. And eventually, all 6 UE fighters were eliminated, as were all who escaped the initial crash. But the black box recorder belonging to one Lieutenant J.G. Jasmine Tuttle was ultimately recovered by an enterprising pirate and sold to her family on Earth. Seeing an opportunity to cover up the embarrassing and costly loss of the Olympus, Naval High Command's propaganda machine broadcasted the recording and made martyrs of the fighter pilots. The result was a series of patriotic advertisements about doing your duty, a melodramatic, government-sponsored holovid called Star Heroes, featuring an array of D-list actors as stereotypical fighter pilots, the establishment of the 36th Fighter Squadron in honor of the pilots who fought the last stand at Null, and the green light for Aegis to begin production on Project Wildcat. Coming in at a length of 21 meters, a width of 17.5 meters, and a height of 5.5 meters, the Wildcat is actually kind of small compared to others that came before it, which allowed it to be designed with forward-swept wings and control surfaces to allow for better atmospheric control, maneuvering thrusters to allow for both vacuum and atmospheric control, and 2 main hydrogen-burning thrusters. The true genius of the Wildcat was its adoption of civilian-style modularity into fighter design. This also meant that it could incorporate the revolution in armament, cooling, power plant, and shield technology that was occurring in the post-war period. This made the ship one of the smallest ever ships to be equipped with both a quantum drive and a shield. Coming just 30 years after the end of the First Tevarin War in 2589, the first model of this new ship represented Aegis' integration of all of the lessons now thoroughly studied from that war. Its primary role was for services aboard smaller capital ships that weren't outfitted for full-scale aerospace operations, to give those ships greater scouting and strike ranges. This ship was nothing short of a revolution, and nearly perfect for the needs of the new UEE, save for one thing: the name. Ivor Mezzer didn't like the ship's initial name, the Aegis Wildcat, which it was given during its development. Ivor was still consolidating his power at the time, and was a frequent user of ancient Roman imagery in his propaganda, and offered a more Roman name for the ship, renaming it the Aegis Gladius. He saw a benefit in presenting the new type of fighter as being the common sword of the people. The growing United Empire of Earth's Navy designated the new spacecraft the P-5G, the designation meaning it was the 5th pursuit craft developed to the production prototype stage by Aegis. The Mazzar administration put production of the Gladius on a war footing almost immediately after its launch, seeking to have the ultramodern fighter design emphasize its powerful overhaul of the human military. The Gladius would score its first space-to-space kill in 2591 in an engagement with a pirate freighter, but primarily it spent its first years serving in propaganda efforts. The Gladius was particularly commonplace in recruiting efforts, where the opportunity to fly one of the spectacular ships was seen as a good way to entice the increased numbers of bodies needed to outfit the growing navy. This was where Squadron 36 came into the picture. The 36th Fighter Squadron formally came online on January 1st, 2589, equipped with the first production run of Gladius fighters. The first charge of the 36th was changing the old standard of treating interceptor pilots as second-rate operators. They did this by grouping the best of the best interceptor veterans to train patrol elements of other squadrons, turning the 36th into the best Gladius pilots of the UEE, but mostly functioning as a training squadron to help other units learn how to better utilize their new advanced ship. The ships would be needed, as by 2603, the tevarin returned, under a new leader with a more advanced fleet, declaring their ambitions to reclaim their homeworld. The Gladius was soon called to action to battle against the enemy that had forged its creation in the final test of its ability as a war machine. Within hours of the formal declaration of hostilities, the 36th found its role entirely upturned, as they had received orders to the front. Quickly transitioning into an active combat role, the 36th found itself dispersed amongst 4 escort carriers charged with providing cover for Mazzar's main battle force. Despite early tevarin successes against human capital ships, none of the warships assigned Gladius coverage from the 36th suffered a single torpedo strike during the full course of the 7-year war. The Gladius as a whole proved its worth during the Second Tevarin War, where it was put to the ultimate test when it faced off against new and improved Tevarin Talons. In these initial battles, the Gladius proved more than a match for the once feared Tevarin fighter, and equally proved effective against striking landing craft like the Prowler, support ships, and even Corvette-sized capital assets. The Gladius quickly made itself an effective case study for the modern space naval doctrine that the war would establish. For the first time, dedicated fleet carriers, capable of operating multiple squadrons of fighters at a time, were constructed and made the centerpieces of battle groups. The Gladius was changing how humans waged war, proving that aerospace fighters were more than just support craft, but the tip of the spear for any future space engagement, especially when the, at the time, mixed fighter and bomber 42nd Squadron proved to be the deciding factor for the victory over the Tevarin. Founded during the First Tevarin War, the 42nd Squadron was designated as a disciplinary unit to handle problematic pilots, defined by military parlance of the time as a kill squad. Often considered disruptive and not dependable, these highly trained pilots represented significant investments of the Navy's time and resources, but were deemed too valuable to simply lock up or discharge in the middle of a war. While the squad had flown in many battles, they did so without distinction, often at the periphery of the fight. During the Second Tevarin War, under the command of Captain Alexandra Dunleavy, the reputation of the squadron changed. Captain Dunleavy noted in early reports that these Kiel Squad pilots were some of the best she had ever seen. She concluded the snap decision-making and self-confidence that made them great pilots often resulted in a resistance towards the Navy's traditional command structure. Determined to turn her squad around, Dunleavy tried an experiment where, rather than outlining a specific flight path and mission plan for her pilots, she simply told them the pickup point. The experiment proved to be a success. Given the ubiquitous use of Gladiuses during this time, it isn't a stretch to say this was achieved through liberal use of the P5G. This would come to ultimate fruition during the Battle of Centauri on June 24, 2610. During the battle, the 42nd was able to trick the Tevarin into beginning to enter their final jump point to their homeworld, before striking them at their weakest and utterly annihilating the Tevarin fleet. proving once and for all that the movement started by the development of the Gladius was the true future of the UEE Navy. Not to mention the creation of the Case Hurricane during the conflict, using much of the lessons learned from the Comet and the Gladius programs to build a modern, heavy fighter, or the adaptation of tevarin atmospheric shields into the top-of-the-line Idris frigate, often paired with the Gladius before, during, and after the war. All of these pushed the Navy away from big gun, big ship mentality to a nimble hybrid force. The Gladius went on after the war to continue to prove its worth, getting an upgrade to the Gladius Mark II sometime after. It continued to be effective against pirates, outlaws, and rebel groups, and served in many roles, including anti-piracy operations, reconnaissance, search and rescue, and more. The ship was produced in such large quantities, in fact, that as the ship got regular upgrades, the older models began to be entirely scrapped. The first military Gladius models were rated for 12,000 hours of flight time before retirement, which equates to roughly 20 years of peacetime service per frame. That number has increased to 35,000 hours with the latest models, but it still means that boneyards around the Empire have been decommissioning the design by the thousands for hundreds of years. For the first 50 years of its service, the UEE considered the Gladius so highly classified that the retired examples needed to be rendered completely flightless. As the Navy settled into extended period of peacetime and civilian spacecraft advanced during the 27th century, stripped Gladiuses began to become available on the civilian market. The first civilian Gladius owners were primarily hobbyist racers that would adapt civilian technology to re-equip the stripped ex-military ships. These Gladiuses would take on unusual silhouettes and be painted garish colors to assist those viewing races from the ground. The ranks of these pilots typically included retired military Gladius pilots seeking to recapture the thrill of their earlier careers. Gladius racing gave rise to a brief period of interest in the use of ships for stunt flying, with several groups of hobbyists forming flying circuses to put on aerospace displays for adoring crowds. While stunt flying has never regained the popularity achieved in the 2650s, Gladiuses are still used for demonstration purposes today, typically with much more reliable original parts. Over time, additional civilian roles for surplus Gladius equipment developed. In addition to typical mercenary operations, Gladiuses have been used for fast courier missions, as flight trainers when equipped with a rear seat, and even adapted as crop dusters. Some Gladiuses have even been outfitted by pirates for raiding purposes, although the vast majority of these ships have become the primary choice of civilian, legal mercenary pilots. Such was the case with one of the arguably most famous Gladiuses ever to exist, which has become known as the Gladius Valiant. The Valiant started its life as a typical Gladius, likely a Mark I or Mark II, but when it had reached the end of its life cycle, it had been sold to a scrapyard, where in 2677, Condi Hillard, a young mercenary, purchased the ship and fixed it up for herself as a means to secure employment. Once completed, Condi and her ship were hired by the Orion Defense Protection (PMC). For the next 4 years, she was assigned to a distant outpost, and things were relatively quiet for Hillard, as she mostly dealt with scrubbers, round hats, or pilots who had too much to drink. That changed the day the vanuul attacked Armitage. This being the first time humanity had ever encountered the vanuul, no one was sure at that point if the attack on Armitage was going to be an isolated incident or the start of something greater. Most settlements in the system decided to wait and see, as the UEE dispatched resources to study the new threat. It was 2 weeks after the initial contact when a vanuul raiding party attacked Hillard's outpost. Luckily, Hillard had been increasing her patrolling, so she was ready when a clutch of scythes appeared on her scans. Utilizing the mobility of her Gladius, Hillard was able to lead her team to destroy the vanuul ships before they could strike at the heart of the outpost. Only 15 lives were lost in the raid, and Hillard and her compatriots became the first pilots to successfully defeat a vanuul force, with Hillard herself being the first human to shoot down a vanuul scythe in her custom Gladius. It was in large part thanks to her success that the Navy decided to dispatch Squadron 36 to the system, after seeing how well the Gladius was faring against this new enemy. With combat successes under their belts after the Second Tevarin War, the 36th never resumed their training role and become the most elite light fighter force in the UEE. Now finding themselves facing a new enemy, the squadron began to study their opponents and learn how best to use their Gladiuses to defeat the vanuul. Captain Jordan Toothpick Hampton was the first to develop the three-fighter carry and leap technique for countering the more muscular vanuul scythe, using the data from the dogfight between the Valiant and the raiding scythes. Squadron 36 helped to expand humanity's knowledge of the vanuul and learn their way of war, while actively developing means to exploit their weaknesses. For instance, it was a 36th Squadron replacement pilot who was the first to notice a slight infrared scanner irregularity that allowed UEE pilots to target early scythes hidden in asteroid fields, saving countless lives from potential vanuul raids. While high-powered Hornets can steamroll through scythe squadrons today, this was not the case in the early days of the conflict. For roughly the first decade of vanuul raids, destroying or disabling a scythe took both extreme maneuvering and a high degree of communication among wingmen. The first was a specialty for the Gladius design, and the second was something ingrained into the highly trained men and women of the 36th. The 36th was also likely the first squadron to encounter the Vanuul Blade, the ship that is considered a one-to-one match for the Gladius, and developed the first tactics to counter the nimble alien craft, relying on the skill of Gladius pilots and their faith in their spacecraft. Unfortunately, the skilled pilots of the 36th were no match for the corruption and sheer insanity of the later mazzars, who constantly failed to give their field commanders the support or time needed to defeat the Vanuul incursions. Thus, one by one, systems bordering vanuul space began to fall. First Orion, then Caliban, then Virgil. Despite the skill and daring of squadrons like the 36th, humanity was slowly losing the war. Still, by the early 28th century, things were looking better for both the UEE and the Gladius. Newer ships were being developed and released to deal with the vanuul threat, including new marks of the Gladius. It was in 2720 that the Gladius logged yet another major first, as its latest version became the first military fighter to carry a short-range jump drive as part of production, leading the way for most future military fighter craft to carry their own jump drives. Despite being well over a century old, the Gladius and its upgrades were still the cutting edge of military aviation. The venerable P5G found new pilots with every new version, who learned how to better exploit its latest additions. Remarkably, despite these upgrades, the exterior of the ship never required much in the way of updating. Things would begin to change, however. A little upstart company founded by former Aegis Dynamics designer Jude Harris Arnold, named Anvil Aerospace, created their first prototype fighter for the UEE Navy, which turned a lot of heads. At this point, Aegis had been sailing on their reputation and comfy ties with the Mazzar regime, relying on upgrades to existing ships with little in the way of new frames since the launch of the Vanguard Heavy Fighter in 2737, itself taking advantage of the new jump technology pioneered in the, at the time, latest Gladius upgrade. The arrival of a new challenger to their throne had already begun to weaken their edge in the market. To make matters worse, the Mazzars themselves blundered into their own demise when pet insurgents of Fiona Mazzar, the sister of then ruling Linton Mazzar, whom she had trained in an attempt to overthrow her brother, went rogue and started a chain of events that toppled the last of the Mazzars. By 2792, Aegis found itself in an impossible position. Their main benefactors were now gone. Their close ties to said benefactors now became a liability, as a new government rose from the rebellion and stripped them of their military contracts. Aegis, a pure military contractor, found themselves with no contracts, and very few people willing to work with them, as many of its lead designers disappeared during the short revolt because of their close ties with both the Mazzars and a long litany of human rights violations. To make matters worse, their rival upstart, Anvil Aerospace, and their old rival, RSI, picked up the contracts which were originally meant for Aegis. Things were looking bleak for the company when their unlikely savior arrived: the general public. You see that since their contracts were stripped, it seems that many of those contract clauses, barring Aegis from selling their ships to civilian markets, were null and void. Starting with the Retaliator, Aegis began making their surplus of older versions of their ships available to the civilian market. The UEE, being in an awkward position where their military was weakened and unable to keep the peace, actually encouraged this move, wanting more effective civilian militia that they didn't have to pay for. So Aegis, the company founded exclusively to make military ships, was now selling the majority of those ships to the general public, including the legendary Gladius. Over time, the company slowly worked its way back into the good graces of the UEE, resulting in the latest generation of the ship, the P5G Gladius Mark VI. Still, the modern P5G suffers against the latest Blade spacecraft encountered on the frontier, with the aging ship beginning to show its limits against an enemy it was never designed to face. Despite this, the exceptional Gladius pilots of Squadron 36 have continued to make headway in developing techniques for countering the superior alien starfighters. A safer weave-style maneuver has also been adapted for countering superior Vanduul forces, all utilizing the unparalleled speed and maneuverability combined with the firepower of the Gladius space frame. Additionally, the Navy has developed a set of run-and-gun tactics for Gladius wingman pairs to help counter the superior abilities of Scythe and Glaive space superiority fighters. Even today, the 36th is still showing how to effectively utilize the Gladius. The squadron's most celebrated action against the Vanduul took place relatively recently, in fact, on August 3, 2940. A force of 12 Gladius fighters were ordered to provide close escort for civilian Hull C transport, ferrying survivors from a recent Vanduul strike. During the course of the planned escort run, the group somehow wandered into a largely undefended rear of a Vanduul supply fleet. By managing fire control through the Hull C and operating as a cohesive unit, the lightly armed force of Gladius was able to quickly eliminate 9 fully laden Vanduul transports and their light escort screen. The incident, coming on the heels of several disastrous Vanduul raids, was played up heavily in the media, bolstering both the squadron's reputation and the reputation of the Gladius. Elements of the 36th are presently forward deployed on the UES Sebek. Little information is available on their current missions against the Vanduul, although the consistency with which 36 Squadron pilots appear in weekly casualty lists indicates that they are in the thick of the fighting. The wing has also been essential to anti-piracy operations, with a number of these operations much better known to the public, with the most famous example being a photo that shows the nose of a Gladius bearing the patch of the 36th, with 24 Drake Cutlass outlines. Despite the military's highly publicized quote-unquote battle-ready campaign to revitalize older space frames, observers are unanimous in believing that the P5G has less than a decade of active service remaining. The final Gladius service pack was issued at the start of 2943, improving weapon systems and control surfaces, and no additional upgrades have been contracted. With the Gladius being increasingly assigned to reserve wings, guard units, and home defense squadrons, the era of these acrobatic light fighters serving as the tip of the sword is coming to an end, as the Navy transitions to the heavier and more up-gun ships of Anvil Aerospace. The rollout of the F-8 Lightning has changed the dynamic for the UEE fighter force, freeing up additional battle-tested Hornets to be handed down. The Navy has begun swapping second-tier Gladius units over to Hornets, as more elite squadrons go from the Hornet to the Lightning. This has not impacted every duty station, as the Hornet is not a one-to-one replacement for the lighter Gladius. Nevertheless, the decommissioning process has created a major surplus of modern Mark VI Gladius hulls and parts, which have been made available to civilians. In 2944, the UEE officially acknowledged civilian Gladius ownership and began selling decommissioned Gladiuses directly to qualified buyers, with the intention of outfitting home defense squadrons that would help delay Vanduul raids where stronger naval coverage was not available. These ships were allowed to retain almost all of their military equipment, being sold with their weapons, thrusters, and a purpose-built declassified version of their standard control systems. This sale of surplus Gladiuses has been seen as unique among similar military spacecraft sales because of the number of spacecraft it has put back into service, and because they have been available to a more widespread portion of the population. Gladiuses and their parts are still produced by Aegis, though not in numbers seen at the height of the Mazzar era. There is an upgrade team still at work which continues to develop functionality for the now widespread civilian adoption of the Gladiuses as well. The Gladius's legacy is immense, being the cornerstone of all modern aerospace fighters built by humanity, and being the testbed for so many advances in aerospace fighter technology. It's hard to find another ship this important in the history of space fighters, especially one that has remained relevant to the field over 400 years after its initial release. It seems that Ivar Mezer's change of the name of the ship to the Gladius was prophetic, as over the centuries, the Gladius truly has become the common sword of humanity. I'd like to thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, think about hitting the like button, subscribing for more content, and hitting the bell icon to be notified when these release. These take a ton of time to research and edit, so dropping a like really helps tell YouTube to promote the video more to other fans of lore content and Star Citizen in particular. I've been watching a ton of Black Pants Legion's Tex Talks Battletech and was inspired by his approach to storytelling about specific mechs, specifically the context of their creation, to try my hand at something similar. So if you enjoyed this, be sure to subscribe to them as well. If you notice my voice is a little off, it's because I'm getting over a cold, but this took me over a month of research and writing to finally get done, so I wasn't going to put it off any longer. For those who joined me after my video on the history of the Titanfall universe and made it through this entire video, man, I have to give you big thanks. And be sure to stay tuned for my own video primer on the Battletech/MechWarrior universe coming out before the launch of MechWarrior 5 Clans. I'd also like to thank those on screen now for supporting the channel financially. If you want to throw in a few credits, think about becoming a member on YouTube. If you want a bit more for your contribution, join the Ko-fi or Patreon. Patreons and Ko-fi members get early, ad-free access to all videos, including exclusive early access to my long-running complete history of Star Citizen lore series. Check those out now in the top right if you want to know what you're getting. Now I want to hear your thoughts on this and any other lore topics in the comments below. And as always, remember, ex historia ad astra.